For 23 years, nobody in Aldous knew that. Not her mother, not her little girl, not the detective who kept her file in the bottom drawer of his desk and looked at it on bad nights. The town buried Diane Mercer, and then the town did something crueler. It moved on. The man who killed her helped carry the casket. He wore a borrowed gray suit. He cried in the second pew. And for more than 2 decades, the people of this small Wyoming town trusted him with their stranded cars, their flat tires, and their daughters. This is the story of how one strand of evidence, kept in an envelope for a generation, finally told the truth nobody wanted to believe. Stay with me. You will not see the end coming, even though it was standing in plain sight the whole time. In the fall of 1996, Aldous, Wyoming was the kind of town where you left your keys in the ignition. Set down in a long brown valley in fictional Renner County, it was a place of maybe 900 people, a grain elevator, 2 churches that disagreed about almost everything, and a single stoplight that blinked yellow after 10 at night. The big news that autumn was the new satellite dish behind the hardware store and whether the high school would finally get a real scoreboard. People still wrote checks at the grocery and waited while the clerk called them in. Dial-up modems sang their strange electronic song in a handful of homes, and most folks thought the internet was a fad for people with too much time. On Friday nights, the whole valley smelled like wood smoke and fry oil from the wagon rest. The truck stop diner out on Route 220 where the long-haul drivers pulled in off the interstate. That diner is where you would have found Diane Mercer. She was 31 years old. She worked the night shift, 6 to 2, and she was raising her daughter, Casey, who was 7 and missing her front teeth and convinced her mother could do anything. Diane drove a rust-colored Datsun with a coat hanger for an antenna. She hummed Patsy Cline when she thought no one was listening. She kept a coffee can of butterscotch candies by the register for the regulars, and she knew every one of them by name. People loved her. That is the part that matters. Remember it. On the night of October 19th, 1996, Diane worked her shift like always. The diner was slow. A cold front was pushing down out of the north, and the truckers stayed put. By midnight, there were 2 customers. By 1, there was 1. At 1:52 a.m., Diane clocked out. The cook, a kid named Petey, watched her pull her jacket tight and walk to the Datsun in the gravel lot. He waved. She waved back. That wave was the last anyone in Aldous would ever admit to seeing. The drive home was 4 miles. Diane never made it. Casey woke at dawn in the house of the neighbor who watched her on work nights, and her mother was not there to get her. By 8 that morning, the neighbor was calling the diner. By 9, she was calling the sheriff. The Datsun turned up at noon. It sat on the shoulder of Route 220, a mile and a half from home. Driver's door shut, keys gone, her purse on the passenger seat with $40 still inside. The hood was cold. One detail stuck in the report and would matter more than anyone knew. There were fresh tow-hook scuffs on the front bumper, as if the little car had been hooked and dragged a short distance. A tow truck had been there. Someone had stopped to help. In a town like Aldous, of course someone stopped to help. The man who caught the case was investigator Tom Bryce. Bryce was 44, divorced, and built like a man who used to play football and then stopped. He kept a daughter's school photo taped inside his hat. His own girl was 9 that year, 2 years older than Casey Mercer. And from the first afternoon, he could not separate the 2 faces in his mind. He worked the case the way you work a case in a county with 1 crime lab and a 6-month backlog. He canvassed the diner. He pulled the regulars. He looked hard at the obvious people first, the way you have to. There was Diane's ex, Casey's father, a man named Dale Hutchins, who drank too much and had hit Diane once years back. For 3 weeks, Bryce was certain it was Dale. Then a trucker's logbook and a way station record put Dale 400 miles away in Rawlins that whole night, and the certainty drained out of Bryce like water from a cracked jug. He looked at a drifter who'd been through that week. Cleared him too. Diane's body was found by an elk hunter on November 9th, in a dry ravine 11 miles south of town. The coroner's finding was plain, and I will keep it plain out of respect. She had been killed the night she vanished and left where few people ever walked. There was male DNA recovered. In 1996, in Renner County, that meant an envelope, a property tag, and a freezer. The technology to do anything useful with it did not yet exist out here. The sample went into evidence. The case went quiet. And Tom Bryce started keeping a copy of the file in the bottom drawer of his desk, where he would keep it for the next 20 years. Time does a strange thing to an unsolved case. It does not close the wound. It just teaches you to walk around it. The first winter, the whole town brought casseroles. By the third winter, the casseroles stopped. And Diane's mother, Ruth, learned that grief is loneliest after everyone else has finished grieving. Casey grew up the way children of the missing and found too late grow up, with a hole shaped exactly like a mother. She lost the rest of her baby teeth. She started school, then middle school, then high school. She learned to drive on the same roads. She graduated in 2007 and did not let anyone take a photo, because the one face she wanted in the picture would never be in another picture again. Ruth kept Diane's room exactly as it was. The Patsy Cline record still stacked by the little turntable for 11 years. And then she packed it up in one long weekend and never spoke of it. Tom Bryce made detective, then made a promise to himself he could not keep, then made the promise again. Every year on October 19th, he pulled the file. He aged. His hair went gray and then went away. He never stopped believing the answer was somewhere in those pages, in a name he had already written down and crossed out. If you have ever loved a question you could not answer, you understand the particular gravity of a case like this. And if you are still with me, do me a favor before we get to the part that changes everything. Subscribe so the channel can keep telling the stories that almost got forgotten. Now, let's get to the envelope in the freezer, because in 2019, somebody finally opened it. The break did not come from a confession. It came from a budget line. In 2018, the state stood up a small cold case unit, 3 people and a grant, and they began working backward through the oldest open homicides in the rural counties. The Mercer file landed on the desk of a detective named Mara Quist. She was 36, the same age Diane never quite reached, and she read the whole box in one sitting and could not sleep that night. The old evidence still existed. That alone was a small miracle. An envelope that 3 different property clerks across 23 years had each decided not to throw away. Quist sent the male DNA to a lab that did something Tom Bryce could only have dreamed of in 1996. They built a genetic profile and ran it not against a database of criminals, but against the vast public family trees that millions of ordinary people had uploaded looking for cousins and ancestors. Here is the method in one plain sentence. Instead of asking whose DNA is this, they asked who are this person's relatives. And then they built the family tree back down to a single name. The work took months. A genealogist sketched a sprawling tree, narrowing branch by branch, until it came down to 2 brothers from a ranch family who had lived their whole lives in Renner County. One brother had died in 2004. The other was very much alive. Quist drove out to see Tom Bryce, retired now, on the porch of a house that smelled like coffee and old paper, and she said the name out loud. Bryce set down his cup. His hand was shaking. He had written that name in his notebook in 1996 on the second day, and then crossed it out, because the man had an alibi. The man had been helping. The man's name was Wendell Crane. Everyone in Aldous knew Wendell. He ran the tow service out on the county road, the only one for 30 miles, which meant that for 30 years, if your truck died in a blizzard or your teenagers slid into a ditch on prom night, the headlights that came for you in the dark were Wendell's. He had pulled half the town out of trouble at one time or another. And in October of 1996, Wendell Crane had done something that made him, in everyone's eyes, the opposite of a suspect. He had volunteered. He joined the first search party and the second and the third. He drove the grid roads for free, his flatbed crawling the shoulders, looking for Diane. He brought coffee to the deputies. After the funeral, he checked on Ruth Mercer through the winters, shoveling her walk, fixing her furnace, asking nothing. And Casey, the little girl with no father in the picture and a mother in the ground, grew up calling him Uncle Wendell. He came to her graduation. He had been the kind, quiet, dependable man at the edge of every photograph for 23 years. That was his alibi. And it was perfect, because who suspects the man holding the flashlight? The tow hook scuffs on the bumper, the detail nobody could ever place, finally had a place. Diane had not been afraid of the truck that pulled up behind her on Route 220 that cold night. Of course she wasn't. She knew the driver. She probably waved. Quist's team built the net carefully. They confirmed the genealogy with a direct sample, lawfully obtained. The profile from the ravine and the profile from Wendell Crane were the same man. On a gray morning in the spring of 2019, detectives turned into the gravel lot of the tow yard Wendell had run for half his life. He was changing the oil in the flatbed. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the badges, and the strangest thing happened. He nodded, as if some part of him had been waiting on that lot for 23 years. He did not run. He was 68 years old, and he simply set the rag down on the bumper and held out his wrists. The town did not believe it. The town refused to believe it at first. People who had been pulled from snowbanks by that man stood in their kitchens and said it had to be a mistake. And then the science was explained, and the disbelief curdled into something colder. The specific horror of realizing that the kindness had been a costume all along. Wendell Crane was charged with the murder of Diane Mercer. Rather than face a trial that would have made his neighbors testify, he entered a plea, and a judge sent him to the state penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I want to leave you with Diane and not with him, because the man does not deserve the last image, and she does. So picture the diner on a Friday night in 1996. The good kind of crowded, the windows fogged from the inside, the smell of coffee and pie. Picture a 31-year-old woman in a worn apron, moving between the booths like she was born to it, refilling cups without being asked, dropping a butterscotch candy into a trucker's hand, laughing at something only she found funny, humming a little Patsy Cline under the fluorescent hum. Picture her glancing at the clock, not because she wanted the shift to end, but because in 3 hours she would tiptoe into a small dark room and kiss the forehead of a 7-year-old girl who thought her mother could do anything. That is who she was. When the arrest came, Casey Mercer was a grown woman of 30 with a daughter of her own, and she stood on the courthouse steps and said the thing that the whole town needed to hear. She said her mother was not a cold case. Her mother was a person, and her name was Diane. And she was finally coming home. Ruth Mercer did not live to see the arrest. She died in 2011, still keeping the porch light on. But Casey put a copy of the news on her grandmother's grave. Weighted down with a single butterscotch candy And she told her grandmother that the question had an answer at last. Tom Bryce came to the sentencing in a suit that no longer fit. He had spent 23 years apologizing to a photograph, and when it was over, an old man wept in a courthouse hallway, not from grief for once, but from the unbearable relief of a promise finally kept. So let me leave you with 3 questions, the kind worth sitting with after the screen goes dark. How many of us would have suspected the man holding the flashlight? How well do we really know the kind, dependable people at the edges of our own photographs? And how many other envelopes are sitting in how many other freezers, waiting for the science and the patience, and the one detective who refuses to forget? Justice does not always come, but sometimes it comes late, carried not by luck, but by the people who would not let go. A mother's killer thought time was on his side. Time, it turned out, was on Diane's. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay a while, because there are others like it, and they deserve to be remembered too. Thank you for sitting with this one. Rest easy, Diane Mercer. Somebody never stopped looking.